At the end of the 1940s, when the country was recovering from a terrible war and life was settling into a new post-war rhythm, Georgy Malenkov held the key, though not always conspicuous, position of Secretary of the Central Committee. In his hands, like in a skillful puppet theater, were concentrated all the threads of work with party cadres. This meant that it was Malenkov who, day after day, prepared and submitted to Stalin himself for approval lists of appointments of regional committee secretaries, ministers, heads of key departments, and other key figures. One can imagine the endless stream of documents that passed through his office. Every signature, every resolution, every visit to his office became a step forward or, conversely, an obstacle in someone's career. Every leader in the Soviet Union, from the director of a small factory to an all-powerful minister, understood perfectly well that his future fate, his promotion or, God forbid, his downfall, depended on a decision signed off on in Malenkov's office. This system created a truly vast network of personal connections for Georgy Maximilianovich and, equally important, people who were indebted to him. These people, who had obtained their positions thanks to his support, became his unofficial allies, forming an invisible but strong foundation for his influence. This is a classic sign of a grey cardinal, a person whose real power is based not on a formal high position or public appearances, but on subtle, comprehensive control over the apparatus, over personnel appointments, over the very system that drove the state. His office may not have been the most opulent, but its doors were open only to those who knew where to go and why, and the decisions made there echoed throughout the vast country. In 1948, an event occurred that significantly changed the balance of power in the upper echelons of government. Andrei Alexandrovich Zhdanov, one of the most influential members of the Politburo and considered Malenkov's main rival in the struggle for proximity to Stalin, died suddenly. The dust had not yet settled after the funeral when Malenkov, as if following a pre-written script, became one of the main organizers of large-scale repressions known as the Leningrad Affair. Imagine Leningrad in the autumn of that year. Morning fog still hangs over the Neva River, and alarming rumors are already spreading through the streets. Yesterday's heroes, those who led the besieged city and rebuilt it from the ruins, suddenly find themselves under investigation. The Leningrad group included such prominent and distinguished figures as Nikolai Alexeyevich Voznesensky, headed the State Planning Committee, and was one of the country's most talented economists, Alexei Alexandrovich Kuznetsov, Secretary of the Central Committee, and one of Zhdanov's closest associates, Mikhail Ivanovich Rodionov, chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. These people were not just functionaries, they had enormous authority and influence. Georgy Malenkov personally traveled to Leningrad to, as they said at the time, carry out purges. He did not simply issue instructions from Moscow. He was present on the ground, chairing meetings where the fate of his recent colleagues in the Politburo was decided, where resolutions on their arrests and sentences were signed. He saw their faces, heard their voices, but acted with cold determination. By destroying this undoubtedly strongest and most influential group of rivals, Malenkov effectively cleared the way for himself to become the second most powerful man in the state. At the same time, all his actions, all this merciless purge, were carried out in the name of Stalin himself, which gave them undeniable weight and left the victims without a single chance. Towards the end of his life, Joseph Stalin increasingly withdrew from the routine management of the state. His health was deteriorating, and his age was taking its toll. During these years, the role of the person who ensured the connection between the leader and the huge state machine became critically important, and this person, controlling the most valuable resource, information, was Georgy Malenkov. He became a kind of filter through which all important documents, reports, and proposals passed. Malenkov was the one who prepared the agenda for Stalin's Politburo meetings, carefully selecting draft resolutions, analytical notes, and reports. In fact, He controlled the entire flow of information that reached the leader. Some things could be presented in one light, some in another, and some might not reach Stalin at all, if Malenkov considered them unnecessary or harmful to his interests. This gave him enormous power, the ability to shape the worldview of the leader and thus influence his decisions. The culmination of this influence was an event that took place at the 19th Party Congress in 1952. Contrary to a long-standing tradition, when the Central Committee's report was always read out by Stalin himself, this time it was delivered by Georgy Malenkov. For the entire party elite, for the thousands of delegates gathered in the Kremlin palace, this was an unambiguous, resounding sign. It was a public confirmation of his special status, a clear hint that he was the real successor, the man whom Stalin trusted to manage party affairs and the entire country. This control extended not only to personnel issues, but also to economic reports, intelligence reports, and even personal letters addressed to the leader. After the 19th Party Congress, the official Politburo, which was the highest party body, was significantly expanded. It now included 25 members and was renamed the Presidium of the Central Committee. Such a large increase in the number of participants, instead of strengthening collegiality, in practice made it cumbersome and, in essence, unworkable. As is often the case, real power was concentrated not in this large public body, but in a small, informal circle that could be called the Presidium Bureau. It consisted of only a few people closest to the leader: Stalin himself, Georgy Malenkov, Lavrenti Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, and Nikolai Bulganin. It was a kind of rapid response team that made the most important decisions. It was here, in a relatively small room where the air was thick with tension and tobacco smoke, rather than in the huge meeting hall, that the main wheels of the state machine turned. There was a special atmosphere in this close-knit group, a mixture of obsequiousness towards Stalin, hidden rivalry among themselves, and constant readiness for any, even the most unexpected, twists and turns. Everyone watched each other closely, trying to guess the leader's thoughts and anticipate the moves of their competitors. It was in this informal bureau that strategic directions for economic development were determined, personnel issues were resolved, and key military and foreign policy initiatives were approved. Here, for example, plans for the construction of new giant factories could be discussed, as was the case with the construction of the Kuibyshev hydroelectric power plant, or large-scale agricultural campaigns capable of changing the lives of millions of people could be approved. Malenkov very often chaired meetings, took the initiative, and coordinated the work of the government and the party. He did not just attend, he actively guided discussions, formulated tasks, and monitored their implementation. In essence, he performed the functions of an unofficial prime minister to an aging leader who was increasingly distancing himself from the daily routine. His role in this narrow circle was not just one of many. It was that of a central figure who organized and directed the activities of the entire leadership. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. This event became a watershed, dividing the era into before and after. People cried in the streets, but in the high offices, a tense, lightning-fast struggle for power had already begun. And in those first hours, full of uncertainty and anxiety, when the future of the country hung in the balance, it was Georgy Malenkov who found himself at the top of the power pyramid. On the same day, almost immediately after the announcement of the leader's death, Malenkov took the highest state post, Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union. This was not just an appointment, it was public recognition of his status as the most likely and prepared successor. Moreover, for 10 days he combined this responsible position with that of the first person in the Secretariat of the Central Committee. That is, he effectively headed both the party apparatus and the government. This short but incredibly significant period, when Malenkov single-handedly held both key positions in the country, was eloquent testimony. It showed that, at the time of Stalin's death, His position as the main heir was recognized by the entire top echelon of the party and state elite. No one disputed his right to leadership at that moment. All the key figures who would later become his opponents were still operating within the established hierarchy, where Malenkov occupied a central place. It was a temporary but complete victory, the result of many years of painstaking work in the shadows. It was during those days, when funeral processions passed through the streets and tense anticipation reigned in the Kremlin, that Malenkov appeared before the country and the world as the undisputed leader. The fact that he was later forced to resign from his party post was the result of a new, sophisticated intrigue initiated against him by Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. But that, as they say, is a completely different story, unfolding in completely different circumstances. Thus, the nickname Grey Cardinal accurately describes Georgy Malenkov's position from 1948 to 1953. Without the formal status of second-in-command in the country, he wielded enormous power through his control of the party apparatus, information, and the methodical elimination of competitors. His story is a vivid example of how true influence in politics is sometimes hidden not behind loud titles, but behind the ability to manage processes and people from the shadows.